She inherited a vineyard no one had set foot in for 31 years, and when she finally broke the seal on the stone vault beneath the old cellar, what she found waiting in the dark wasn't just $410 million in wine the world had spent decades believing was lost forever. It was the reason her mother had spent an entire life pretending the Ashford name didn't exist. The reason Della had grown up with no aunts, no cousins, no photographs on any wall that reached back further than her own childhood. Nothing but a small silver cup on a chain, and a mother who went quiet and cold and far away every single time anyone asked her where she came from. The foreclosure notice had been sitting on the kitchen table for 9 days when the second envelope arrived. Della Mercer read the first line of the notice again, by the light over the stove, the way she'd read it every night that week, as if the words might have rearranged themselves into something survivable while she slept. They never did. Redmond County Bank regretted to inform her that her loan was in default. She had 90 days. After that, the farm her husband Tom had been born on, the farm his father had been born on, the 212 acres of hay ground and the leaning red barn, and the little white house with the crooked porch, would be sold at auction to whoever showed up with cash. She was 34 years old, and she was about to lose the only home her daughter had ever known. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Josie was asleep down the hall, 7 years old and dreaming, one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit that had lost an ear sometime during the winter Tom died. Della had checked on her twice already. She kept finding reasons to. There was something about watching the small rise and fall of her daughter's breathing that made the numbers on the table feel a little less like a verdict. Then she'd come back to the kitchen, and the numbers would be exactly where she'd left them, patient as stones. The drought had done most of the killing. 2 summers with almost no rain, the creek dropping to a brown trickle, the hay coming in thin and light and worth half what it should have been. Then the tractor. Then Tom under the tractor, on a slope he'd driven 1,000 times, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, and after that nothing had gone right, and nothing had felt right, and Della had learned to carry a grief so heavy it changed the way she walked. She'd sold the good truck. She'd sold Tom's welding rig and his grandfather's shotgun and the horse trailer they'd never really needed. She'd taken a second job 3 nights a week cleaning offices in town, 40 minutes each way, driving home at midnight with her eyes burning and the radio turned up loud so she wouldn't fall asleep at the wheel. None of it had been enough. That was the thing nobody told you about being poor. You could do everything right, work until your hands cracked and bled, go without and go without and go without, and the hole only got deeper, because the hole wasn't a thing you dug. The hole was a thing that was dug for you, by interest rates and dry skies and a body pinned under 3,000 pounds of steel, and all your effort did was keep you from sliding in a little faster. She almost didn't open the second envelope. It was heavy, cream-colored, the kind of paper that cost money to be. The return address said Kessler and Doyle, attorneys at law, with a town she'd never heard of printed underneath. Perrin Valley, Oregon. She turned it over in her chapped fingers and felt the old reflex rise up in her, the one her mother had drilled into her without ever once saying it out loud. Nothing good comes in an envelope like this. Expecting things is how you get hurt. Keep your head down, keep it small, and don't let anybody know you have anything worth taking, because the moment they know, they'll come for it. She opened it anyway. She was too tired to be afraid of paper. The letter inside was typed and formal and cold, and she had to read it 3 times before it stopped sliding off her mind like water off glass. Dear Miss Mercer, we are writing to inform you that you have been named the sole beneficiary of the estate of Vivienne Margaret Ashford, of Perrin Valley, Oregon, who passed away on the 11th of March of this year. Miss Ashford left specific and detailed instructions that her estate be transferred to you upon proper identification. The estate consists principally of real property, being the Ashford Vineyard and its associated structures and approximately 40 acres of land, together with all outbuildings and their contents. All applicable taxes have been settled in advance through a standing trust. There are no debts encumbering the property. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange the transfer of the deed. Della sat very still. Ashford. She knew that name the way you know a word in a language you were never taught, a shape your mouth almost remembers. Her mother's name had been Colette. Colette Mercer, on every document Della had ever seen, on the death certificate she'd signed with a shaking hand 3 years ago in a county hospital, while a machine went quiet in the next room. But once, exactly once, When Della was maybe 9, she'd found a photograph tucked inside the lining of her mother's coat pocket while she was hanging it to dry. A young woman in a garden, laughing, sunlight in her hair, and on the back, in faded blue ink, 2 words: the Ashfords. She'd asked about it. She could still remember the way her mother's face had changed, how the softness had gone out of it all at once, like a light switched off in a far room. Her mother had taken the photograph out of her hands, not roughly, but not gently either, and she'd said, in a voice Della had never heard her use before or since, "We don't talk about that. We don't say that name. Do you understand me, Della? We don't have people. It's just us. It's always just been us." And then she'd gone out to the porch and stood there in the cold for a long time, alone, and Della had watched her through the window and understood, in the way children understand things without being able to explain them, that she had touched something that hurt. She never asked again. You learned, in that house, which doors stayed closed. Now the door had a name: Vivienne Margaret Ashford. An aunt. Her mother's sister, it had to be. A woman Della had never met, never heard spoken of, never known existed, who had died alone in a valley Della couldn't find on a map, and who had spent her last act on earth reaching across whatever silence had swallowed their family to hand Della a vineyard. She pulled her phone out and searched the name. The results were thin. An obituary, 4 lines long, the kind you pay for by the word and can't afford many. Vivienne M. Ashford, 81, of Perrin Valley, Vintner, preceded in death by her father, August Ashford, and her sister, Colette. No survivors listed. No service. She had, apparently, no one. Right up until the paperwork found Della. Della got up and went to the drawer in the front room, where she kept the things that mattered. The small things. The ones she'd carry out the door first if the house ever caught fire. Josie's hospital bracelet. Tom's wedding ring on a length of fishing line. And under those, in a scrap of blue velvet worn shiny with handling, the one thing her mother had left her that wasn't furniture or debt. A small silver cup, shallow and dented, about the width of her palm, with a ring soldered to the rim so it could hang from a chain. There was a little handle shaped like a curled vine leaf. Della had grown up thinking it was some kind of odd locket, or maybe a christening cup, though no one had ever christened her. Her mother had never told her what it was. She'd only told her to keep it, on one of the last clear days before the end, gripping Della's wrist with a strength her wasted body shouldn't have had. "Keep this. It's yours. It's the only true thing I ever gave you." And then, so quietly Della had leaned in to hear it, "When the time comes, it'll open the right door." Della had thought it was the medication talking. Her mother had said a lot of things at the end that didn't hold together. She turned the cup over now under the kitchen light. On the underside, worn almost to nothing but still there when you tilted it against the light, was an engraving. A cluster of grapes on a curling stem, and around it, following the curve of the metal, a ring of small strange marks. Not letters. Not any alphabet she knew. Just symbols, spiraling, like a code somebody had made up so that only the people who were meant to read it ever could. She sat back down at the table, the foreclosure notice on one side, and the lawyer's letter on the other, and the little silver cup cupped in both her hands. And for the first time in a long time, Della Mercer felt something she'd almost forgotten the shape of. Not hope exactly. Hope was too big and too expensive a thing to keep in that house. But a question. An open door where before there had only been a wall, and she was so tired of walls. She told her brother-in-law first, because he was the closest thing she had to family since Tom, and because she needed to say it out loud to someone before she did anything foolish. Kurt came by the next morning to look at the notice, the way he'd been coming by since the funeral, well-meaning and heavy-handed, a man who fixed things because he didn't know how else to help. He read the lawyer's letter standing in the kitchen with his cap pushed back, and he laughed. Not cruelly. That was almost worse. He laughed the way you laugh at a child who's told you she's going to be a mermaid when she grows up. "Della," he said. "A vineyard, out in Oregon. You know what a place like that costs to run. Dead vines, dead equipment, a house nobody's lived in for God knows how long. You'd be pouring money into a hole, and you don't have money to pour. You've got a hole right here." He tapped the foreclosure notice. "Focus on the one that's about to swallow you and Josie." "I'm not saying I'd run it," Della said. "I'm saying it's 40 acres and a house, free and clear, no debt. The letter says so. If I sold it, even for scraps, that's more than I've got now. That might be enough to keep this place." Kurt shook his head, patient and certain. "Sight unseen, You don't even know if it's worth the gas to go look. Places like that, there's always a catch. Back taxes, liens, the whole thing condemned. Somebody left it to you because nobody else would take it. He softened, seeing her face. Look, I know a guy who buys land. I could call him, tell him about the deed. He'd give you something for it just to take the headache off your hands. You wouldn't even have to leave the county. That was the moment, though Della didn't fully understand it yet, that decided everything. Because she heard in Kurt's voice the exact thing she'd heard her whole life. The advice to keep it small. To take the sure small thing and be grateful and not reach for the uncertain large one. Because reaching was how people like them got hurt. It was good advice. It had kept her mother alive and it had kept Della fed. And she was suddenly, fiercely done with it. I want to see it, she said. First, before I sign anything or sell anything. I want to stand on it and see it with my own eyes. Kurt sighed the sigh of a man who'd done his duty and been ignored. It's a 9-hour drive. Who's got Josie? She could stay with the Petersons a couple of days. Or I take her. Della was already deciding. It's summer. School's out. She's never seen the ocean, and Oregon's got an ocean. She looked at her daughter, who was sitting on the floor by the screen door, drawing a picture of a horse that looked more like a large dog, humming to herself, unaware that the ground under her small life was 3 months from opening up. We could use a couple of days that aren't about all this. Kurt looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled his cap back down and said, just don't get your hopes up, Della. That's all. Don't build anything on it in your head, because it's a lot easier to lose something you were already living in than something you only ever imagined. He meant it kindly. It was the truest and the most useless thing anyone said to her in that whole long month. They left 2 days later, before dawn, in the old sedan that was the last vehicle Della owned outright, with a cooler of sandwiches and a bag of Josie's coloring books, and the little silver cup zipped into the inside pocket of Della's jacket, because she couldn't stand to leave it behind. Josie fell asleep before they'd cleared the county and slept most of the way through the high desert, waking only when the land began to change, when the brown and the sage gave way to green hills, and then to a valley so different from home it might have been another country. Perrin Valley opened up beneath them near the end of the second afternoon. Della pulled onto the shoulder just to look at it. The valley floor was a quilt of vineyards, long straight rows running up and over the low hills, impossibly ordered, impossibly green, the light coming through them gold and slow the way light does at the end of a summer day. There were tasting rooms with cars parked out front and stone gateposts, with the names of estates carved into them. Families that had clearly been making money out of this dirt for a long time. It was beautiful in a way that made Della's chest tight, because it was the kind of beautiful that had never been for her, the kind you drove past on the way to somewhere you actually belonged. Look, Mama, Josie said, her nose against the window. It's all lines. It is, Della said. It's all lines. The town itself was small, older than the money around it. A few blocks of brick storefronts and a diner and a hardware store and a church with a white steeple. Kessler and Doyle turned out to be a single office above the pharmacy. Up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked under Della's boots the way old wood does when it's been carrying people up to hear news for 100 years. Walter Kessler was somewhere past 70, thin and courtly, with reading glasses pushed up into white hair and a handshake that trembled just slightly when he took Della's hand. He looked at her for a beat too long when she said her name, and something moved behind his eyes, some old recognition or old sorrow, before he caught himself and gestured her to a chair. Josie he set up at a side table with a legal pad and a cup of pencils and a sleeve of crackers from a drawer, as if he'd done it before, as if he'd once had children of his own come through this office and learned how to keep them quiet. I was Vivienne's attorney for nearly 30 years, he said, settling behind the desk. And her friend, I'd like to think, as much as she let anyone be. He folded his hands. She was a private woman. I don't think that will surprise you. I never met her, Della said. I never even knew her name until last week. I'm sorry. I don't understand why she'd leave me anything. I don't understand any of this. No, Kessler said slowly. I don't imagine you do. He opened a file on the desk, thick and worn, the kind of file that gets handled for decades. She was very clear about you. From the beginning, from the first day she came to me. The estate was to go to her sister Colette's child, and only that child, and only once that child was found and properly identified. Not before. She was adamant about the timing. He looked up. She told me, more than once, that it could not go to you until it was safe. Until what was safe? Della asked. Kessler didn't answer that directly. Instead, he drew a single sheet of paper from the file and turned it around on the desk so it faced her. Vivienne left instructions for how you were to be identified, he said. She refused a photograph. She refused to rely on records. Said records could be forged. Said anyone determined enough could produce a birth certificate. She said the true heir would be able to prove herself with one thing that could not be faked, because there was only ever one of them, and it never left the family. On the paper was a drawing, a hand drawing, careful and exact, done in ink by someone who knew the thing they were drawing by heart. A small silver cup, shallow, with a ring at the rim and a handle shaped like a curled vine leaf. And on its underside, drawn in fine detail, a cluster of grapes ringed by a spiral of small strange marks. The room seemed to tilt very gently, the way the deck of a boat does when a swell passes under it. Della reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and drew out the cup and set it on the desk beside the drawing, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Kessler leaned forward. He compared them, the drawing and the object, his old eyes going back and forth, and Della watched his breath catch. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the Tastevin. That's exactly it." "The what?" Della said. "Tastevin." He pronounced it carefully. Tat-von. A tasting cup. Winemakers used them for centuries, to judge a wine's color by the light coming through the silver. He touched the rim of hers, not quite lifting it. The way you touch something you can't believe is real. "This one belonged to your family, to the Ashfords." Vivienne said it went to America with her father, and that when her sister left, she gave it to Colette so there would always be a way to know her own blood, even after everything, even after they stopped speaking. He looked at Della, and his voice was gentle. "Your mother kept it. All those years, she kept it. That tells me more about her than anything else could." Della's throat had gone tight. "My mother never told me what it was. She just said keep it, and that when the time came it would open the right door." Kessler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was right about that too." He reached into the file drawer and brought out a ring of keys. 3 of them, heavy old brass keys strung on a loop of wire. "2 of these are for the house and the outbuildings," he said. "The third one Vivienne said you'd understand." He held them out. She said, and I wrote it down at the time because it seemed such a strange thing to say. She said, "The girl won't need the third key. She'll have the cup. The cup is the key. Just make sure she goes down before she decides anything. Make sure she sees what's below the cellar before she signs a single thing." "What's below the cellar?" Della asked. Walter Kessler shook his head slowly, and for the first time he looked not courtly, but old and tired and a little afraid. "I don't know," he said. "In 30 years I never went out there past the front room. Vivienne wouldn't allow it. Nobody's been in the lower cellar since her father sealed it, and her father died in 1998. She had a door put in down there, years ago, a special door, cost her more than the house was worth, she told me once, and laughed when she said it, though it wasn't a happy laugh." He handed Della the keys, and his hand was steady now, as if letting go of them had settled something in him. "It's yours now, all of it, whatever's down there. God knows she paid enough to keep it waiting for you." He drew a hand-drawn map from the file and walked her through it. The road out of town, the turn past the Brennan farm, the long gravel drive nobody had graded in years. He told her the neighbor to the north, a woman named Etta Brennan, had a key to the house and had been keeping an eye on the place, and that Della should stop and say hello, because Etta had been the only friend Vivienne had in the world and would want to meet Colette's daughter before she heard about it secondhand. And then he stood and took Della's hand again and held it a beat longer than he needed to. "She waited a long time for you," he said. "I hope you'll forgive her for whatever it was that kept you apart." I don't think she ever forgave herself. The drive out took 20 minutes. The valley narrowed as they went, the big estates falling away behind them, the road climbing into rougher country where the vineyards gave way to oak, and the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to something that was barely a road at all. 2 ruts running up a hillside between fences gone gray with age. Josie had stopped talking and was watching out the window with the solemn attention children give to places that feel like they're holding their breath. Then they came over a low rise, and there it was. The Ashford Vineyard spread across the south face of the hill, and even choked and wild as it was, Della could see what it had been. The rows were still there, running up the slope in their long ordered lines, but they'd gone feral. The vines heaved up off their fallen wires and grown into each other, a tangle of leaf and cane climbing over the collapsed trellis in a slow green riot. Grass stood knee-high between the rows. At the top of the slope, where the land leveled, sat the house, a low stone farmhouse with a steep roof and small deep windows. Weathered but square and solid, not falling down, just waiting. Behind it and set into the hillside was a larger stone building with a wide arched door. The winery, the cellar, whatever it had been, half swallowed now in ivy and wild rose. And over all of it, the late sun lay gold and heavy and silent, and there was no sound at all but the wind moving through 31 years of neglected vines. A dry whispering rush, like the whole hillside was murmuring something it couldn't quite bring itself to say out loud. "It's a jungle," Josie breathed, delighted. "It is," Della said, and got out of the car. The wind hit her the moment her boots touched the ground, sharp and clean and smelling of dust and crushed leaf and something sweeter underneath. Something almost like fruit, though there was no fruit on those wild vines that she could see. She stood for a moment just looking. Somewhere in her, under the exhaustion and the grief and the arithmetic of survival, a small door she'd kept locked her whole life shifted on its hinges. This was hers. This dirt, these ruined rows, this stone house on this silent hill. Whatever else was true, whatever catch Kurt had warned her about, this piece of the earth had her name on it now, and a woman she'd never met had wanted it that way badly enough to spend 30 years keeping it safe for her. The house key turned in the lock with only a little protest, and the door swung inward on a room that smelled of dust and cold ash and time, and something else, faint and clean, like dried herbs. Della stepped inside and stopped. It was cleaner than it had any right to be. The furniture stood where furniture had always stood, a worn sofa, a heavy table, a rocking chair by a stone hearth. Dishes sat in a rack by the sink. A kettle waited on the stove. It was less like a place that had been abandoned, and more like a place someone had stepped out of one afternoon, meaning to come right back, and simply never had. Josie pressed close to Della's leg, subdued now. The delight of the jungle gone quiet in the presence of all that stillness. "Who lived here, Mama?" she whispered. "My aunt," Della said, and the word felt strange and enormous in her mouth. "Your great-aunt. Her name was Vivienne." The walls were covered in photographs. Della moved along them slowly, Josie's hand in hers, reading a life in black and white and faded color. A tall, stern man in a hat standing in front of the young vineyard. The rows freshly planted and staked. The hillside bare. August, she thought. The father. Her grandfather. A man whose face she was seeing for the first time in her life. A young woman beside him, dark-haired and unsmiling. And then the same young woman older and older. 30 years of a life lived alone on this hill, aging in the frames as Della walked the length of the wall. And then, near the end, a photograph that stopped her cold. Two young women, arms around each other, laughing, standing in the vineyard in full green leaf with the sun behind them. One of them was Vivienne, young, maybe 25, and the other one, softer, rounder in the face, her head thrown back mid-laugh, was Della's mother. Colette, young and happy and whole, in a way Della had never once seen her, not in any memory she owned. Her mother had never in Della's life laughed like that. Whatever had happened to teach her not to, it had happened after this photograph was taken. Della lifted it off the nail with careful fingers and turned it over. On the back, in the same faded blue ink as the photograph she'd found in her mother's coat a lifetime ago, 4 words. Vivienne Cole. Before. Before what? She said, out loud, to the empty house. The house didn't answer, but her eye had already gone to the next frame down, and the breath went out of her all at once. It was Vivienne, older, maybe 40, standing on the porch of this house, and in her arms, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, was a baby. On the back, when Della's shaking hands turned it, was a date and a single line. She was here. Just once. I held her. Then I never saw her again. The date was the year Della was born. She stood in the cold quiet of the front room with the photograph in her hand and her daughter pressed against her side, and she did not understand, not yet, not fully, but she felt the shape of it moving toward her out of the dark, the way you feel a train coming through the soles of your feet before you ever hear it. This woman had held her. When she was a baby, this stranger, this aunt, had held her once and then never seen her again, and her mother had taken her away, and had spent the rest of her life refusing to say the name of the sister who'd laughed with her in the sun. "Mama," Josie said, tugging at her hand. "Mama, you're squeezing. Sorry, baby." Della crouched down and pulled her daughter into her, more for her own sake than for Josie's, and held her, and breathed, and let the wave pass over her. "I'm sorry. I'm okay." She kissed the top of Josie's head. "Let's find you somewhere to sit and color, okay? Mama needs to look at some things. And then we'll find a motel with a pool. Deal?" "Deal," Josie said, mollified by the promise of a pool, and let herself be settled at the heavy table in the front room with her coloring books and the last of the crackers and strict instructions not to wander outside. Della made herself walk through the rest of the house first, because she needed something ordinary to do with her hands while her mind reeled. She found the bedroom, the bed neatly made under a faded quilt, a hairbrush, and a jar of hand cream on the dresser, as if their owner might return that night. She found a bathroom, a pantry still half-stocked with sealed jars, a small room lined floor to ceiling with books, and on a low shelf in that room, a row of journals. Dozens of them, cloth-bound, uniform, spines faded, each one dated on the spine in a slanting careful hand. The earliest, read 1985. The most recent bore this year. She would come back to these. But the light through the windows was going fast now, blue and thin, and there was one thing Walter Kessler had pressed on her harder than anything else, one instruction that pulled at her more than any book on any shelf. And go down before you decide anything. See what's below the cellar before you sign a single thing. The cup is the key. She found Josie at the table, coloring in the last of the day. "Come on, Bug," she said, keeping her voice easy. "Help me explore one more thing while it's still light, and then we'll find that pool." Josie came willingly, glad to be moving, and Della took the ring of brass keys and let them out the side door toward the larger stone building set into the hillside, the one half swallowed in ivy, the winery, the cellar, whatever it had been. The wide arched door was heavy and swollen in its frame, and it took both hands and her shoulder to force it. Inside, the air was cool and still, and smelled of old oak and stone and the ghost of wine, a smell that seemed to come up out of the floor itself. It was one long room, dim, with a vaulted ceiling and rows of empty racks along the walls, and a few great wooden barrels standing in the shadows, gray with dust, their staves cracked. Josie's voice went small and echoey. "It's like a church," she whispered, and stayed close to the door where the last daylight fell, exactly as Della told her to. At the far end, set into the back wall where the building went deepest into the hill, was a set of stone steps going down. Della clicked on her phone light and went carefully, 10 steps, then 12, into a cold that deepened with every one, until the steps ended at a small landing. And there, filling the whole of the wall in front of her, was a door that had no business being in a place like this. It was steel. Not old iron, not wood banded with metal, but a single seamless slab of gray steel, thick as a bank vault, set into the living rock with a precision that must have cost more than this whole hill was worth. There was no handle, no keyhole she could see, no dial, nothing but a smooth cold face and, at its center, a shallow circular recess about the width of her palm. Della leaned in with the light, and her breath fogged the beam, and around the recess, etched fine into the steel, she saw them, the symbols, the same spiraling marks that were on the underside of the cup in her jacket, a cluster of grapes, and a ring of strange writing that was no writing at all. Her hands were not quite steady when she drew out the Tastevin. She held it up to the light, then to the recess, and the size was exactly right, and the crest on its face lined up with the crest cut into the steel, as if one had been struck from the other. She pressed it in. Nothing happened. She turned it, clockwise, then back. She pushed harder, feeling the cold metal bite into her palm. She held it there and waited and listened, but there was only the vast silence of the stone and the small nervous scuff of Josie's shoes on the landing above, and her own heart going hard in her ears. Whatever opened this door, it wasn't only the cup. It was the cup and something else. Something she didn't have yet. Something her aunt had known and taken to her grave, or written down somewhere in 31 years of journals stacked on a shelf in the room above. "Mama," Josie called down, thin and unhappy in the dark. "I don't like it down there." "Coming, baby," Della said, and took one last look at the sealed steel face and the crest that matched her mother's silver cup, and climbed back up out of the cold toward her daughter and the last of the light. Back inside the house, with every door locked and the curtains drawn and Josie wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, Della took the oldest journal from the shelf, sat down on the floor with her back against the books, and began to read the story of the family she'd never had. The early entries were about the vineyard, about frost and bud break and the price of barrels, about a father growing old and hard to please, about the loneliness of a young woman running a place too big for two people in a valley, where everyone else had families and neighbors and money. About a man named Peter she'd loved and not married, though the journal never quite said why, only that he'd wanted her to leave the vineyard and she couldn't, and that some doors, once you understand what's behind them, you can't walk away from. There was love in those pages, and there was duty, and even in the young handwriting there was a thread of fear running under all of it, faint but constant, like a draft from a room you can't find. Della read for a long time, the light through the small, deep windows going from gold to amber to gray.
Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story.
Josie's crayons scratched faintly in the next room, and then she reached an entry, dated in the summer of the year before Della was born, and the fear that had been running quiet under all those pages rose up out of them and stood on the paper in plain words. They came again today, Vivienne had written. The third time this year. This one was smoother than the others. An Englishman, very polite, very expensive suit, sat at my table and drank my coffee and talked about the weather and the market, and then, so gently, so kindly, asked whether I'd ever considered what was really down in my father's cellar. As if he were asking after my health. He knows. They all know now, or they think they do. The Valcourt name has been dead for 80 years, and still they can smell it. Still they come sniffing up my drive with their soft voices and their soft threats. Father warned me this would happen. He said the money would find us eventually. That money like that never stops looking. That it has no memory of the blood already spilled, and no fear of spilling more. I told the Englishman I didn't know what he was talking about. I told him my father kept nothing down there but empty barrels and old debt. He smiled and thanked me for the coffee and left. But he'll be back. They're always back. And Cole is pregnant now, and I am so afraid, because the moment they understand that there's a child, everything changes. A child is a lever. A child is a way to make me open the door. I have to think. God help me. I have to think, because I will not let them use my sister's baby to pry loose my father's ghost. Della read it twice. Then she sat very still on the floor of that cold, quiet room, the journal open in her lap, and understood the first hard piece of it. Her mother hadn't left because she was ashamed of where she came from. Her mother hadn't hidden the Ashford name out of some old family quarrel, some falling out too petty to explain. Her mother had run because staying would have painted a target on the back of the child she was carrying. Because somewhere below this house, behind a door that cost more than the house was worth, was something men would kill for, had already killed for, and the only way Vivienne could think of to protect that baby was to send her away, to cut every thread that connected her to this hill, to teach her sister to be small and silent and afraid so that the men with the soft voices would lose the scent. The baby was Della. She got up off the floor slowly, her legs stiff, her mind very clear and very cold. Outside, the light had nearly gone. Through the small window of the book room, she could see the vineyard sloping away into blue shadow, the wild rose going dark, the wind still moving through them, the whole hillside whispering its long secret to nobody. And she could see, at the bottom of the drive, where the two ruts met the gravel road at the property line, a car. It hadn't been there when they arrived. She was certain of that. It sat with its lights off in the last of the dusk, dark and low and expensive, the kind of car that had no reason to be idling at the foot of a ruined vineyard 9 hours from anywhere. and there was a man standing beside it. Just standing. One hand resting on the roof, the other holding something to his ear or his face. She couldn't tell in the failing light. Looking up the hill. Looking at the house. Looking, she understood, with a certainty that turned her stomach to ice. At her. Della stepped back from the window. Her heart was going hard and fast, but her hands, when she looked at them, were steady, and some cold, competent part of her that had gotten her through the worst 2 years of her life took over and started giving orders. Get the child. Lock the doors. Don't turn on more lights than you have to. Don't let them see you're afraid. Josie, she said, keeping her voice light as she came into the front room. Hey, Bug, change of plans. We're going to stay here a little bit longer, and I need you to help me by being super quiet, okay? Like the quiet game. Can you do that? Josie looked up from her horse. Are we sleeping here? Maybe, Della said. She was already moving to the windows, drawing the heavy curtains one by one, checking each latch. Maybe just for a little while. She crossed to the front door and turned the old brass key in the lock. And then, for good measure, she dragged the rocking chair over and wedged its back under the handle, the way you did when you were a woman alone in a house at the edge of the world, and there was a man at the bottom of your driveway who had no name and no business and no reason to be there but one. When she risked the window again, edging the curtain back a half-inch with one finger, the car was still there. The man was getting back into it. And then the headlights came on, sweeping once across the dark hillside, across the wild rose and the stone face of the house, and Della pulled back from the glass and held her breath until she heard the engine turn over and the tires crunch slowly away down the gravel road, the sound fading into the enormous silence of the valley until it was gone. But she knew it wasn't gone. She knew, the way Vivienne had known, the way her mother had known for 31 years without ever once saying it out loud, that it would be back. That whatever her grandfather had carried up this hill in 1945 and sealed behind a door in the dark, whatever her aunt had given up her whole life to guard, whatever her mother had run across the country and buried the family name to keep her safe from, it was still down there, waiting under her feet, and she was not the only one who had been waiting for that door to finally open. Della sat down in the dark with her daughter dozing against her shoulder, and Vivienne's journals stacked around her on the cold stone floor, and she did not sleep. She read. All through that first long night in her aunt's house, she read by the small light of her phone, turning the pages of a story about stolen wine and dangerous men, and a woman who had loved her sister enough to break both their hearts to save a child neither of them would ever really get to know. The older journals told the beginning of it, the part before the fear, the part that reached back further than Vivienne herself. She had written it down the way you write down a thing your father finally tells you late in his life, when he decides you're old enough to carry it. August Ashford had gone to war a farm boy from this same valley, and had come home in 1945 as something else, something quiet and watchful that never fully came back to the light. In the last year of the war he had been in France, in Burgundy, in the wine country there, and he had seen a thing he could never unsee and never quite explain. There had been an estate, a great old chateau, the Chateau de Valcourt, and it had a cellar that men spoke of the way they spoke of legends. Generations of bottles reaching back before anyone living could remember, vintages that no longer existed anywhere else on Earth. And in 1942, a German officer, a cultured man, a collector, had taken it. Not for the army, for himself. He had emptied the Valcourt cellar bottle by bottle into crates and sent them east to vanish into a private hoard, and he had shot the old vintner who tried to stop him, and burned the estate records so no one could ever prove what had existed or where it had gone. The Valcourt family did not survive the war. The name died, and the cellar, the greatest lost cellar in the world, became a ghost that collectors have been chasing ever since. August had found part of it. In the chaos of the war's last weeks, moving through a country coming apart at the seams, he and 2 other men had come on a rail siding and a set of crates that should not have been there, marked with a name he had been told to watch for, and they had understood in an instant what they were standing in front of. The other 2 men were dead before the month was out, one to a mine and one to something Vivienne's father would never say. August lived, and with the records burned and the family gone, and the collector already disappearing into the ruin of Germany, with powerful friends and a long reach, August Ashford made a choice his daughter wrote about with something close to awe. He could not return the wine, because there was no one left to return it to, and because the men who had stolen it were still alive and still looking, and would kill him the day they learned he had it. He could not sell it, because selling it would light a beacon they would see from across the world. So he brought it home, crate by crate, over 2 years and at a cost he never named. August Ashford carried the lost cellar of Valcour up a hillside in Oregon and sealed it in the rock beneath his own house. And he planted a vineyard on top of it for cover. And he spent the rest of his life pretending to be nothing more than a struggling grower in a valley full of them. Tucked between the pages were the clippings Vivienne had saved, brittle and yellow. A short one in French that Della could not read but understood anyway, from the small photograph of a burned estate above it. Later ones in English, a paragraph here and there across the decades, wine writers and auction houses wondering aloud whether the Valcour cellar had truly been destroyed, or whether it was out there still, waiting, worth a fortune beyond reckoning to whoever found it. And one, near the bottom of the stack, that made Della's stomach turn. A death notice from 1991, the year she was born. A man named only as a wine dealer, found at the foot of a hotel stairwell in Geneva, ruled an accident. Vivienne had written 2 words in the margin beside it, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. Not an accident. He had come too close, the journal said. He had started asking the right questions in the right rooms, and then he was dead. And 3 weeks later, the polite Englishman was sitting at Vivienne's table drinking her coffee. That was when she understood there would be no waiting them out. That was when she began to plan how to send her sister and her sister's unborn child somewhere the name Ashford would never follow. And somewhere near dawn, when the first gray light began to come up over the eastern hills and touch the tops of the wild rose, Della made a decision. She was not going to sell it. She was not going to call Kurt's guy and take the small sure thing and drive home and lose the farm slow instead of fast. She was 34 years old, and she had spent her entire life being taught to keep her head down and want nothing and expect nothing and never, ever reach. And she was done. Her grandfather had reached and paid for it. Her aunt had reached and paid for it. Her mother had refused to reach and had paid for that too. Had paid in a lifetime of fear and silence and a laugh Della had never once heard. Whatever was behind that door, it was hers. It had been kept for her, at a cost she was only beginning to understand. And she was going to go down there, into the dark, and see what her family had died to protect, no matter who was waiting at the bottom of the drive, no matter what it cost. Because for the first time since a machine went quiet in a county hospital, and a tractor rolled on an ordinary Tuesday, Della Mercer had found something worth being brave for. She had a family who had loved her. She just hadn't known it until now. And somewhere below the cellar, behind a door her mother's silver cup was made to open, she had the truth. Della must have slept, in the end, because she woke. She came up out of it all at once, the way you do in a strange bed, in a strange house, her heart already going before her eyes were open, and for a long disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the cold stone under her hip and the smell of dried herbs and old ash placed her, and she remembered. The vineyard, the vault, the car at the foot of the drive. She was on the floor of the book room with a journal still open across her lap and gray morning light coming in through the small deep windows, and Josie was curled against her side under the blanket, thumb near her mouth the way she hadn't slept in years. And somewhere outside a bird was singing like nothing in the world was wrong. For a while Della just lay there and let herself be afraid without doing anything about it. Because there was no one watching and it seemed important to get it out of the way. Then she got up, careful not to wake her daughter, and went to the window and looked down the long slope of wild vines to the gravel road at the property line. There was no car. There was nothing but the ruined rows going down the hill in the flat early light, and the fences gray with age, and the road empty in both directions as far as she could see. In the daylight, it was almost possible to believe she'd imagined the whole thing. The man and the low dark car and the headlights sweeping the house. Almost. But Della had learned, in the last 2 years, the difference between the fears you make up to torture yourself and the ones that are trying to tell you something true. And this one had the weight of the second kind. She'd read 3 decades of another woman's fear the night before, and she knew now that it hadn't been imaginary either. She made coffee on the old stove, which took some doing and a long search for matches. And while it boiled, she stood at the counter and made a list in her head, because a list was a thing she could hold on to. Find out how to open the vault. Keep Josie safe. Figure out who the man was and what he wanted, though she already knew what he wanted. And she remembered what Kessler had said in his creaking office over the pharmacy. Stop and see Etta Brennan. She was the only friend Vivienne had in the world, and she'll want to meet you before she hears about it secondhand. An ally. Della had been alone with the worst of everything for so long that the word felt foreign in her mind, like a coat that belonged to somebody else. But she was standing in a house full of a dead woman's secrets with men circling in the dark, and she had a 7-year-old asleep in the next room, and she was not too proud to want someone in this valley who knew more than she did. The Brennan place was half a mile north, a working farm, tidy where the Ashford Vineyard was wild, with a white farmhouse and a red barn, and a border collie that came out barking and then, deciding Josie was acceptable, flopped over to have its belly rubbed. A woman came out onto the porch drying her hands on a dish towel, and stopped when she saw Della, and stood very still. She was somewhere in her 70s, small and square and weathered, with steel-gray hair pulled back hard and eyes that missed nothing. And she looked at Della's face for a long moment, with an expression Della couldn't read. Something between grief and disbelief and a kind of terrible hope. "You're Colette's girl," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Lord have mercy. You've got her whole face. "I'm Della. Della Mercer. The lawyer, Mr. Kessler. He said I should come and find you. He said you knew my aunt." The woman came down off the porch slowly, still staring, and then she reached out and took Della's hand in both of hers, and her grip was strong and rough and warm. "Etta Brennan," she said. "I knew your aunt for 51 years. I was the closest thing she had to family, and she was the closest thing I had, and I have missed her every single day since March." Her eyes had gone bright. "And I have been standing at my kitchen window for 4 months looking at that hill, waiting to see if anybody would ever come." She squeezed Della's hand hard. "She said you would." Near the end, when she knew it was coming, she said, "Etta, one day Colette's daughter is going to drive up that road. And when she does, you tell her the truth, because I won't be here to." She looked down at Josie, who was solemnly petting the dog. "And who's this?" "This is my daughter, Josie." Etta crouched down with the ease of a woman who'd spent her life getting up and down off the ground, and she looked at Josie for a moment, and something in her face broke and mended all at once. "Vivienne would have loved you," she told the little girl. "She loved things that grew." She stood back up, one hand on her knee, and looked at Della. "Come inside, both of you. I've got fresh biscuits and this one looks like she could eat. And you and I have a great deal to talk about, and some of it isn't for little ears. She's welcome to the barn cats and the swing out back, if that suits." It suited. Josie was gone to the barn within 5 minutes, delighted, and Della sat at Etta Brennan's kitchen table with a cup of real coffee and a plate of biscuits she was too wound up to eat. And Etta sat across from her, and for a while the old woman just looked at her. "You slept up there last night," Etta said finally. "I did. Then you saw the car." Della's stomach dropped. She set the coffee down. "There was a car," she said carefully. "Last night, at dusk, down at the bottom of the drive. A man standing next to it, looking up at the house. When he saw me watching, he left." She swallowed. "You know about it." "I know about them," Etta said, and her voice had gone flat and hard. "I've been watching those cars come and go up that road for the better part of 30 years. Honey, not often. Once a year, maybe. Sometimes less, sometimes a stretch of quiet, and then 2 in a month. Fancy cars. Men in nice clothes who don't belong out here and don't know how to hide it. They'd go up, they'd sit with Vivienne a while, and they'd come back down, and every single time, after, she'd be different for a week. Quiet, jumping at sounds, checking her locks. She looked at Della. I asked her about them. Of course I did. 51 years, you ask. And she'd just shake her head and say, Etta, the less you know about my visitors, the safer you are. And I'd let it go, because she asked me to, and because I trusted her more than I trusted my own good sense. Etta's jaw worked. I've spent 4 months wishing I hadn't let it go. Della told her. Not all of it, not the parts still forming in her own mind, but enough. The inheritance, the Tastevin that was the key, the sealed vault below the cellar, and the symbols on the steel that matched the cup. The journals, and what they said about a lost cellar of wine August Ashford had carried home from the war and hidden in the rock, and about men who had wanted it for 80 years and had killed to get close to it, and about why Colette had taken her baby and run and buried the family name. She watched Etta's face as she talked, and she watched the old woman go from grief to a grim, unsurprised understanding, as if pieces she'd carried loose for decades were finally clicking into a shape she'd always half known. So that's what was under there, Etta said quietly when Della finished. All these years, wine. She shook her head slowly. Vivienne wouldn't so much as let me pass the front room of that house. Not once in 51 years. I thought it was just her way, her privateness. She let out a breath that shook a little. Wine worth killing for, sitting in the dark under a hill, and she gave up her sister and her sister's baby and her whole entire life to sit on top of it and keep it safe. She looked up at Della, and her eyes were fierce. You listen to me. Whatever else you learn about your aunt, you learn this first. That woman was the bravest, loneliest, most stubborn soul I ever knew, and she loved your mother, and she loved you, sight almost unseen, more than she loved her own life. Don't you let anybody ever tell you your family didn't want you. They wanted you so bad they gave you up so you'd live. Della didn't trust herself to answer that. She looked down at the coffee and the biscuits going cold, and she breathed until she could speak. Mr. Kessler said her death was natural, she said. A heart thing. Sudden. Etta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, like she was setting something heavy down. I'll tell you what I told the county, for all the good it did. Vivienne Ashford was 81 years old, and healthy as a horse. She hauled her own firewood. She drove herself everywhere. 3 weeks before she died, she helped me pull a calf at 2 in the morning in the freezing rain, and she outlasted me at it. And then one morning I go up with her mail, and she's gone, sitting in her chair, and the doctor comes and signs a paper and says her heart gave out. And everybody nods, because that's what happens to old women, isn't it? Their hearts give out. Etta leaned forward. But 3 days before she died, honey, there was a car up that road. I saw it. And I never told a soul, because who would I tell? And what would I say? I've got no proof. I've got an old woman's feeling. But I have had that feeling for 4 months, and it has not once let go of me. And now you sit here and tell me what's under that hill. And I want you to understand something. The men who did whatever they did to your aunt did not get what they came for, because she sealed it. She died before she'd opened that door for them. Which means it's still down there. Which means they are still out there. And now you've driven right up into the middle of it with a little girl. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, faintly, Della could hear Josie laughing at the barn cats. I know, Della said. I figured that out somewhere around midnight. She looked at Etta. I'm not going to run. I thought about it. I could sell the deed to the first buyer and drive home and let the whole thing be somebody else's problem. But my grandfather carried that wine up a hill to protect it, and my aunt spent her life on it, and my mother lost her whole self to it. And I am not going to let the men who did that just walk up and take it. And there's something down there worth $400 million, Etta, or more. And I've got a farm that's 90 days from the auction block, and a daughter who deserves a life. So no, I'm not running, but I need help. I don't know how these people work. I don't know who I can trust. Etta studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, like a deal had been struck. All right, she said. Then here's the first thing. You don't do a single thing with the county. Not the sheriff, not the local police. This is a small valley, and there's a great deal of money in it. And money that old and that patient has friends in more pockets than you'd believe. Vivienne always said that. Trust nobody local. She reached across the table and put her hand over Della's. But I've got a nephew. My sister's boy, Cade. He's with the state police, and before that he did a stretch with a federal task force back east. The kind that chases stolen art and looted things. And he is the single most honest man I have ever known. Which has cost him plenty in his life and made me proud of him every day. If there's a right way to do this, a safe way, Cade will know it, and Cade won't be bought. She squeezed. Let me call him. Let me get him out here. And in the meantime, that little girl of yours is going to stay right here with me on this farm, where there's dogs and neighbors, and a shotgun over the door, and not up on that hill where the men with the cars can see her. You hear me? That's not a request. Della felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since she'd opened the lawyer's letter. Thank you, she said, and her voice cracked on it. I don't have people. I never have. I don't really know how to let anybody help. You've got people now, Etta said simply. You've had them all along. You just didn't know where they were buried. She got up and went to the phone on the wall, the old kind with a cord, and she started to dial. Go on back up, she said over her shoulder. Find out how to open that door. Something tells me your aunt didn't leave you a key without leaving you the way to use it. She was too careful for that. Look for a letter. Vivienne was a great one for letters. She never said a hard thing out loud in her life that she could write down instead. Della went back up the hill alone, and the house felt different now that she knew what Etta knew, the silence of it less like abandonment and more like a held breath. She stood in the book room, among the journals, and thought about what Etta had said. Look for a letter. And she thought about the 3 brass keys Kessler had given her, and the strange thing Vivienne had told him. The girl won't need the 3rd key. She'll have the cup. 2 keys had fit the house and the cellar, but the 3rd had fit nothing Della had tried, and it was a smaller key, older, with fine wards, the kind that opened not a building but a box. She found the box in the bottom drawer of the writing desk, in the corner of the book room, under a false panel that only gave itself away, because the drawer was shorter inside than out. A strong box, iron, heavy, with a keyhole the size of the 3rd key's bit. It turned with a smooth oiled click, a lock that had been cared for, and inside, on top of a stack of documents and old photographs and a small velvet bag that clinked, was an envelope, cream paper, and written across the front, in the same slanting, careful hand as 31 years of journals, 4 words that stopped Della's breath. For Colette's daughter, when she comes. Della sat down on the floor of the book room with her back against the desk, exactly the way she'd sat to read the journals, and she opened the letter from the aunt she had never met, and she read it in the gray morning light with her hands shaking. My dear girl, the letter began. I don't know your name. Your mother never told me what she called you, and I understood why, and it is the smallest of all the things I have grieved, but I have grieved it every day. I have thought of you as the baby I held once. For 1 hour, in the spring you were born, before I put you back in your mother's arms, and told her to run and never look back, and never speak my name to you or to anyone. If you are reading this, then you are grown, and you have my sister's silver cup, and you have found your way to this hill, which means the danger has waited long enough that the lawyers finally let you be found, and it means I am gone. I am sorry to meet you this way, in ink, from the other side of it. I would have given anything to meet you with my own 2 hands, but this is the only way that was ever safe, and safety has been the whole shape of my life, and yours, though you never knew it. I have to tell you what is under this house, and why, and I have to tell you what it cost, because you are about to inherit all of it, the treasure and the danger both, and you deserve to go into it with your eyes open, the way your mother never got to. The letter told her the whole of it then, more plainly than the journals ever had. The Château de Valcourt and its legendary cellar. The German officer, a collector named Reinhard Voss, who had looted it in 1942 and murdered the old vintner and burned the records and vanished the greatest run of wine in the world into a private hoard. Meaning to enjoy it after the war, he was so sure his side would win. How August Ashford, Della's grandfather, a farm boy from this valley, had come on part of that hoard in the ruin of 1945 and had understood in a heartbeat what it was, and had made the choice that shaped 4 generations. He could not give it back, because Valcourt was ashes and the family was dead. He could not sell it, because Reinhard Voss had survived, had slipped his friends and his money out of Germany ahead of the reckoning, and had spent the rest of his life hunting for what he still considered his. So August carried it home and buried it in the rock, and planted a vineyard over the top and told no one, and built a lock that only his own blood could open, and made his daughters swear to guard it. And Reinhard Voss's family had never stopped looking. His son, then his grandson, Alistair Voss, who was alive today, an old man now himself, rich beyond counting, and who had made the recovery of the Valcourt cellar the obsession of his life, the way his father and grandfather had before him. They believed it was theirs. They believed the blood already spilled for it entitled them to spill more. And over the decades they had found the trail, inch by inch, until it led them to a hillside in Oregon and a quiet woman who grew grapes and would not answer their questions. The letter did not spare itself. Vivienne wrote about the men who came, the polite ones and the not polite ones, the offers and then the threats. She wrote about the wine dealer in Geneva, who had gotten too close to the truth in 1991, and had died at the foot of a stairwell 3 weeks before a smiling Englishman appeared at her table, and about how in that moment she had understood that the danger would reach her sister and her sister's unborn child as surely as water finds the lowest ground. Because a child is a lever and love is a weakness, these men knew exactly how to use. And she wrote about the choice she had made, which was the same choice her father had made, the choice this family kept making, generation after generation, to give up the person rather than the secret, to send Colette and her baby away, cut off, nameless, safe, and to stay behind alone and hold the line, so that the men with the soft voices would lose the scent and turn their patient hunger on an old woman who had nothing left to lose but her own life. "I do not ask you to forgive your mother," the letter said. "There is nothing to forgive. She did the bravest thing a mother can do, which is to become a stranger to her own child so that child can grow. She hated me for making her do it. She told me so, the last time we spoke, on a telephone in a bus station. And I have carried her hate all these years like a stone in my coat, and I have been grateful for it, because her hating me meant she had run far enough and buried it deep enough that you were safe. If she was cold to you, if she never spoke of family, if she taught you to want nothing and expect nothing, and keep yourself small, then know that she did it out of a love so fierce it looked like its opposite. She spent her whole life making herself small so that you could live. Do not let her sacrifice, or mine, be for nothing." Then the letter told Della how to open the door. "The lock is my father's work," Vivienne wrote, "and my father was a clever man made cleverer by fear. The cup is the key, but the cup alone is not enough, because a key can be stolen and he knew it. You must press the cup into the recess in the steel, and then you must turn it, and as you turn it you must bring each mark on the face of the cup into line with its twin cut into the door, in order, and the order is the order of the harvest, which is the one thing no thief could ever learn, because it is not written anywhere but here and in the blood. Turn to the mark of the bud, then the leaf, then the flower, then the fruit, then the fall, then the frost, then the rest. Bud, leaf, flower, fruit, fall, frost, rest. The whole life of the vine, in a circle, the way it goes every year, the way it went for my father and for me, and will go for you if you choose to stay. 7 turns. On the last the door will open. It has not been opened in 27 years. Be ready for it to take your breath. And then, near the end, the plea. When you see what is down there, you are going to want to keep it, and no one on earth would blame you. It is worth more money than either of us can truly imagine, and I know what your life has been, because I have imagined it every day, and I know what that money could do for you and for your child. But I am going to ask you not to keep it, and I am going to trust you to understand why. Because you are August's blood, and Colette's daughter, and I have to believe the same thing runs in you that ran in them. That wine was stolen. Men died for it. Good men. The old vintner who tried to guard it, and the dealer who tried to expose it, and, I suspect, others I never knew. It belongs to the world, in the light, where people can taste history and be moved by it, not in the dark under a hill or in the private hoard of a family who murdered to own it. Give it back. Bring it into the open. Let it be seen. Take what the law allows you for finding it, and it will be more than enough to save your farm and your child's future 10 times over. And give the rest away, to the memory of Valcourt, to the people the Voss family stole from, to children who grow up the way you did, wanting. But do it carefully. These men are still out there, and they are patient, and they will not stop simply because the secret is out. Trust no one in that valley. Do not go to the local police. There is a man you can call, a federal agent named for cultural property crime, and if he is still working, I have written his name and number on the back of this page, and if he is not, then his office is the one to find. The ones who chase looted and stolen art, because that is what this is, the largest looted thing they will ever have laid before them. Document everything before you tell anyone. Photograph it all, and keep that little girl of yours, if you have one, somewhere those men cannot reach, because they know, as I know, that a child is the fastest way to make a mother open any door. I love you. I have loved you your whole life from the far side of a silence I built to keep you safe. I am sorry I never got to know the woman you became. I have to believe she is brave, because she is standing in my house reading this, and that took more courage than most people ever spend. Finish what my father started. Set it right, and then go and live the life the 3 of us fought so hard to give you. Your aunt, who loved you, Vivienne. Della sat on the floor of the book room for a long time and cried in the way she hadn't let herself cry since Tom died, ugly and silent and shaking, for her aunt and for her mother and for the little girl in the barn who would grow up knowing, finally, that she came from people who had loved her so much it had broken all of them. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest, and she made a promise to a woman she'd never met, out loud, in an empty house. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'll set it right. I promise. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She took the letter down to Etta. She couldn't have said why, except that she couldn't hold it alone, and Etta had loved Vivienne for 51 years and deserved to know what she had died protecting and why. The old woman read it at her kitchen table, with her reading glasses down her nose and her lips pressed thin, and by the end she was weeping openly, without shame, the tears running down the deep lines of her face and dropping onto the cream paper, and when she finished she took off her glasses and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and sat like that for a long moment. 51 years, she said, when she could speak. 51 years I knew that woman and I never knew the half of it. I thought she was just private. I thought she had her heart broken young and never got over it. Etta laughed, wet and broken. And all that time she was carrying this. Alone. She could have told me. I would have carried some of it. She folded the letter along its old creases with shaking hands and gave it back to Della like it was made of glass. She wouldn't, though. That was her. She would rather bleed than hand you her burden. Etta reached across and gripped Della's wrist. You are not to be like that. You hear me? You've got people now. You let them carry some. Out the window Della could see Josie on the tire swing under the big oak, pumping her legs, her hair flying, the border collie racing back and forth beneath her, and the sight of it went through Della like a blade. Her daughter, 7 years old, safe and laughing in the afternoon sun, with no idea that her mother had just read a dead woman's letter about murdered families and men who used children as levers. Della thought about the line in the letter, "Keep that little girl somewhere those men cannot reach." And she thought about Colette taking a baby and running across a whole country and burying a name, and watching Josie fly on that swing. She understood, all the way down, that she would do the same, that there was no line she wouldn't cross and nothing she wouldn't give up to keep her daughter on that swing in that sun. She stays with you, Della said, until this is finished, whatever it takes. I can't have her up on that hill. She stays with me, Etta agreed. She's already half mine anyway. That child and my barn cats have an understanding. She squeezed Della's wrist once more and let go. Now, Cade will be here by evening. He's driving down from Salem. Said he would leave the minute he could get free. And she got up to start supper, because that was what Etta did with fear. She cooked, and the ordinary sound of a pan on the stove and an old woman moving around a warm kitchen was the most comforting thing Della had heard in a very long time. The afternoon went slow. Della sat on Etta's porch and watched her daughter play on the swing, safe, and turned her aunt's letter over and over in her mind, and tried not to look too often down the road toward the Ashford Hill. She waited until Cade Brennan arrived before she opened the vault. It felt right, and it felt safer, and Etta had insisted. He came up the hill in a plain truck late that afternoon, a big man in his late 30s in jeans and a work shirt, with his aunt's sharp eyes and a quiet, careful way of moving and speaking, a man who watched a room before he entered it out of long habit. Etta had told him enough on the phone that he arrived already grave, and when Della showed him Vivienne's letter and the strongbox and the drawing of the Tastevin, he read it all slowly, twice, and when he was done he sat back and let out a long breath. If half of this checks out, he said, it's the biggest cultural property case anybody's seen in a generation. Looted Nazi-era art and wine, an unsolved murder or two, a hunt that's been running for 80 years. He looked at Della. And you're right in the middle of it. He tapped the letter. Your aunt gave good advice. No locals. And the agent she named, I know that office, might even know some of the people. We do this by the book. We do it careful. And we bring in the feds who handle exactly this. And we do not let anybody know what's down there until it's documented, and there are people with badges standing on it. Agreed? Agreed, Della said. But first, Cade said, and something in his careful face shifted. First, I think you'd better open it. Because right now this is a dead woman's letter, and an old cup and a lot of words, and no agency in the world is going to move heaven and earth on that. We need to know it's real. He stood. And I'd like to be standing next to you when you find out. In case those men decide today's the day. He touched his hip, where Della realized he was wearing a sidearm under the work shirt, just in case. They went down together, Della and Cade, down the stone steps into the deepening cold with 2 flashlights. And the steel door waited at the bottom exactly as it had, seamless and gray and patient. Della drew the Tastevin out of her jacket and held it a moment in the beam of the light. Her grandfather's key, her mother's cup. She thought of August carrying crates up a hill in the dark, and Vivienne alone for 30 years, and Colette laughing in the sun before, and she pressed the cup into the recess in the steel, and it seated with a soft, solid click, exactly the size. exactly the shape. "Bud," she said, and turned it, bringing the first mark on the cup's face around to meet its twin cut in the door. And deep in the mechanism something moved, a tumbler falling into place with a sound she felt in her teeth. "Leaf." She turned it again. Another tumbler, another soft heavy fall. "Flower." "Fruit." "Fall." She said each one out loud, the whole life of the vine, the way it went every year. And with each turn the lock answered, layer by layer, a mechanism her grandfather had built out of fear and love, and machinist's patience 80 years ago, coming awake under her hands. Frost. The 6th turn. Rest. On the 7th, the door shuddered. Then it moved. It swung inward on its own weight, slow and enormous, on hinges that had held 27 years of stillness. And a breath of air came out of the dark beyond it that was cool and clean and dry and old. Air that had been sealed away since before Della was grown. And under the cellar cold there was a smell she would never forget as long as she lived. The deep, sweet, earthy ghost of 10,000 corks and centuries of wine, breathing out into the world for the first time in a generation. She heard Cade, beside her, say something under his breath that might have been a prayer. Della lifted her flashlight and stepped through the door, and the beam swept out into the dark, and she stopped, and she could not move, and she could not speak, and she understood at last, all the way down, what her family had died to protect. The chamber was enormous. It ran back into the hillside far beyond the reach of the light, a vaulted stone cellar carved out of the living rock, cool and dry and utterly still, and it was full. Rows of wooden racks marched away into the dark on either side, floor to ceiling, and every rack was full of bottles, thousands of them, tens of thousands, lying on their sides in the dark with their necks toward the aisle, furred gray with the soft dust of decades, their old glass catching the light in dim green and amber and near black. Some were shapes she knew, and some were shapes she'd never seen, squat and hand-blown and lopsided. Bottles that had been made by human breath before there were machines to make them. Wax seals, cracked and ancient, bore the pressed shape of a crest she recognized from the journals, a tower and a vine. The Valcour crest. The lost cellar of Valcour, not a legend, not a ghost, but real. And here, in the rock under an Oregon hill, saved by a farm boy and guarded by his daughters for 80 years and waiting, all this time, in the dark, for Della. She walked down the center aisle in a kind of trance, the light trembling in her hand, reading the little cards tied to the racks in a spidery old-fashioned hand, August's hand. Years that stopped her cold. 1784. 1799. Vintages from before the sickness that had killed nearly every old vine in Europe, a century and a half ago. Wines that could not exist anymore, that existed nowhere on earth but here, in this dark, on these racks. She found a rack near the back, set apart, with a card that read in August's hand simply, "The Great Year," and below it a run of bottles from a single vintage of a wine whose name she had read in the auction clippings. A name wine writers spoke of the way ordinary people spoke of the pyramids, and there were not 2 or 3 of them, the way the world believed a handful might still exist somewhere. There were dozens, a whole rack, an impossibility, a fortune inside a fortune. They went deeper, the 2 of them, their lights swinging over row after row, and the chamber kept giving. Racks of Burgundy so old the labels had long since rotted away, known only by August's cards. A wall of fortified wine in squat dark bottles. A rack of nothing but magnums, great heavy things, each one furred and sleeping in the dark. Della stopped in front of one rack, and, because she had to, because it did not feel real until she did, she reached out and lifted a single bottle from its cradle with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, cold, the glass rough and imperfect under her fingers, the dust coming away soft as ash. Hand-blown. Older than her country, she held in her 2 hands a thing worth more than everything she had ever owned in her life put together, and it was warm from nothing and cold from the rock, and it was only a bottle, and it was the weight of 80 years, and she set it back into its cradle as gently as she had ever set Josie down asleep. In a low alcove near the back, set apart from the wine, she found a wooden chest, plain and battered, the kind a soldier might have carried home. It wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were her grandfather's war things. A folded uniform gone stiff with age. A tarnished set of dog tags with a name she was seeing for the first time in her life, her own blood, August L. Ashford. A bundle of letters tied with string, in a young man's hand, addressed to a girl back home, who must have grown up to be Vivienne and Colette's mother. And underneath all of it, pressed flat between two pieces of card, a single photograph, cracked and faded, of a great stone chateau standing whole and grand in a valley of vines. And in front of it a family, an old man in a work apron with a proud hard face, a woman, 3 children, all of them squinting into a long-ago sun. On the back, in August's hand, 4 words that told Della everything about the man she'd never met. The people it belonged to, he had kept it. All those years, guarding a fortune he could have sold 10 times over, August Ashford had kept a photograph of the family he could never give it back to, because they were Ash and he was the only one left alive who remembered they had ever existed. He hadn't hidden the wine to own it. He'd hidden it because it was the last thing left of people the world had tried to erase, and someone had to remember them, and it had fallen to him, and then to his daughters, and now, in the cold and the dark, it had fallen to Della. She held the photograph in the beam of the light and understood the shape of what her aunt had asked of her, all the way down. Give it back, bring it into the open, not for the museums and not for the money, but so that the name Valcour would exist again in the light, so that the old man in the apron and his squinting children would not have been erased after all, so that 80 years of one family carrying the memory in the dark would finally mean something out loud. Kate had crouched beside a set of instruments Della hadn't noticed, tucked against the alcove wall. Look at this, he said quietly. Humidity gauges, a hygrometer. There's a whole system down here, old but working, vents, some kind of passive climate control cut right into the rock. He shook his head slowly. She kept it perfect. 30 years, alone, an old woman climbing down into this cold, to read the gauges and keep the air right so not one bottle in 10,000 would turn. He looked up at Della. That is not a woman guarding money. That is a woman keeping a promise. Della put the photograph carefully back in the chest, on top of her grandfather's letters, and closed the lid, and made herself a second promise there in the dark, one she didn't say out loud, that the old man in the apron would get his name back. It was as much a part of this now as saving the farm, as much as Josie's future, as much as making the Voss family answer for what they had done to her aunt. She would set all of it right, or she would go down trying. At the far end, where the chamber narrowed, there was a small table and a chair, and on the table a great leather ledger, and Della opened it with careful hands and found her grandfather's inventory, every bottle, every vintage, catalogued in his patient hand across pages gone soft with age, and at the front, in newer ink, in Vivienne's slanting script, a single line she must have added late in her life, doing the arithmetic she never spoke of to anyone. Della read it, and read it again, and sat down hard in the chair, because the number Vivienne had written, her own careful estimate of what the world would pay for the lost cellar of Valcour, was $410 million. Kate had come up quietly behind her, his own light playing over the racks, over the impossible dust-furred rows of it, and when he spoke his voice was hushed with something close to fear. Della, he said, do you understand what you're standing in? He didn't wait for her to answer. This is the most valuable single collection of wine on the planet. It doesn't have a rival. There is nothing else like it anywhere, because everything else like it is gone, drunk or lost or destroyed 100 years ago, and it's all right here, and it's all real, and half the collectors in the world have spent their whole lives and fortunes just chasing the rumor of it. He turned in a slow circle, and your aunt sat on top of it alone for 30 years and never told a living soul, and never sold one bottle, not even when she was old and poor, and it would have set her up like a queen, because it wasn't hers to sell. He looked at Della, and there was awe in his face, and grief. My God, what that woman gave up. Della sat in her grandfather's chair with her aunt's ledger open in her lap, surrounded by $410 million in the dark, and she did not feel rich. She felt the weight of it, the whole 80 years of it, the crates carried up the hill and the sisters sent away, and the letters written to a child who never came, and the old woman dying alone in a chair upstairs 3 days after a car came up the road, and she made herself say the thing out loud, to Cade, to the dark, to her aunt. I'm not going to keep it, she said. She told me not to, and she was right. It's stolen. People died for it. I'm going to give it back, most of it, to the world, the way she wanted. I'll take what the law allows me for finding it, enough to save the farm and give Josie a life, and the rest goes back into the light. She closed the ledger. But first we have to keep it safe, and we have to keep them from taking it. And we have to make somebody pay for what they did to her. Cade was already nodding, already the careful professional again, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Then here's what we do, he said. We document everything. Tonight, every rack, every card, the ledger, all of it. So no matter what happens, the record exists, and it's yours. And it's out of anybody's hands but the law's. Then first thing tomorrow I make the calls. To the people your aunt named. The Federal Cultural Property Team. And we get agents out here to secure this site before word can travel. Because the second word travels, this valley is going to fill up with people who want it. He looked at her hard. And between now and then, nobody sleeps up here. And that little girl stays at my aunt's. And we stay together and we stay awake. Because if those men have been watching this house the way you say, then they may already know more than we want them to. They spent the next 2 hours in the cold, photographing everything, working down the rows with their phones and Cade's camera, the leather ledger and its terrible arithmetic, the impossible cards in August's hand, the wax seals and the crest and the great year set apart at the back. Della worked in a kind of numb focus, and somewhere in the middle of it the enormity of what her life had become settled over her, quiet and huge, that she had come up this hill 90 days from losing everything, and had walked into the center of a story 80 years old and drenched in blood, and that there was no walking back out of it now. Her grandfather's ghost, her aunt's love, her mother's silence. All of it had come down through the years and landed on her, in the dark, and there was no one left to carry it but her. It was full night when they came up out of the cellar. And, as they stepped out through the swollen arched door of the winery into the dark, Della saw them. Down at the foot of the drive, where the 2 ruts met the gravel road. Headlights. Not 1 car this time. 2. 2 low dark shapes idling at the bottom of the hill, with their engines running and their lights off now, sitting exactly where the single car had sat the night before, patient, waiting. And as Della watched, frozen, the doors opened, and figures got out, and stood, and began, without any hurry at all, to walk up the hill toward the house. Cade's hand closed hard around Della's arm. Inside, he said, his voice low and flat and utterly changed. Now, and get behind me. They had run out of time. The men who had hunted the lost cellar of Valcour for 80 years. The men who had emptied a chateau and burned its records and murdered the people who tried to stop them across 3 generations. The men who Della was now certain had come up this same road 3 days before her aunt died and left an old woman dead in her chair, had finally seen the door open, and they were coming to take what they believed was theirs. They got inside and Cade threw the bolt on the front door and killed the lights, and in the sudden dark, Della's heart was going so hard she could hear it. Through the small, deep window beside the door, she could see them coming up the hill in the last of the dusk, 3 figures moving unhurried through the wild rows, and the sight of that lack of hurry was worse than running would have been. They had all the time in the world. They believed it belonged to them. Cade had his phone out, low against his chest, the screen shielded. He was talking fast and quiet, and Della caught pieces of it. Active situation. The Ashford place off County Road 9. 3 subjects on foot, at least 1 likely armed, and then a string of numbers and codes she didn't understand. And then, get me Vance. Wake her up. Tell her the Valcour thing is real, and it's happening tonight. He ended the call and looked at Della in the dark, and his careful face was hard and steady. Troopers were already rolling, he said. I called it in when I got here, before we went down. Told my captain and told the federal office both. Nearest units are maybe 20 minutes out, and that's if the roads cooperate. He drew the sidearm from under his shirt, checked it, held it low. So we don't do anything stupid. We keep the door between us and them. We keep them talking, and we run out the clock. 20 minutes. You understand me? We just have to be alive in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Della looked at the man on the hill and thought about how long 20 minutes could be. The knock, when it came, was almost gentle. 3 soft raps on the old wood, polite as a neighbor come to borrow sugar. Then a voice, cultured, unhurried, with the faint gravel of great age under it. Ms. Mercer, the voice said. Or should I say Ms. Ashford? I know you're in there. I saw the lights go out. There's no need for any of this. I'm an old man, and I've come a very long way, and I have no wish to frighten you or your friend. I would simply like to talk. He paused. My name is Alistair Voss. I believe you've read about my family. Della said nothing. Cade shook his head at her, a small hard motion. Don't answer. I'll take your silence as a yes, Voss said. Then you'll understand why I'm here, and you'll understand that I'm not going to leave. Not tonight. Not after 80 years. Do you have any idea, child, what it is to spend your entire life reaching for one thing? To be born into the reaching. My grandfather reached for it and died reaching. My father reached for it and died reaching. And I am 86 years old, and I have reached my whole life. And tonight I stood at the bottom of that hill, and I watched the light change in that cellar window, and I knew. He let out a long breath on the other side of the door. It's down there, isn't it? You opened it. After all this time, a struggling little widow from nowhere opened the door that we could never open, because your grandfather built it to answer only to your blood. He almost laughed. There is a terrible joke in that somewhere. That wine was stolen, Della said. She couldn't help it. The words came out of her before Cade could stop them. Your grandfather stole it. He murdered the man who tried to guard it, and he burned the records so nobody would even know that family had ever lived. It was never yours. It was theirs, and they're dead. And you don't get to have it just because you wanted it long enough. There was a silence on the other side of the door. When Voss spoke again, the warmth had thinned, and something older and colder showed through. You've read your aunt's little diaries, I see, he said. She was fond of that word. Stolen. She said it to me too, the first time I came, 30 years ago, sitting at that very table, so proud, so certain. As if the world runs on deeds and receipts. He drew a slow breath. Let me tell you how the world actually runs, child, since no one seems to have taught you. It runs on will, on the ones who reach and the ones who don't. The Valcourt family, whatever they were, are gone. Erased. The old man in that photograph your grandfather no doubt kept. He is dust, and his children are dust, and there is no one left in this world who cares whether they lived or died except a few sentimental fools who like to feel noble about a name they never knew. But that wine is real. It is the greatest thing human hands have ever made, and it should belong to someone who understands it, someone who has spent a lifetime worthy of it, not sit rotting in the dark under a hill so that a dead spinster could feel righteous. His voice dropped. I have offered your family a fortune, more than once, to simply step aside. Your aunt refused me, and your aunt is dead. I would very much prefer that you make a wiser choice. The threat sat in the dark room like a live thing. Della felt it go through her cold and clear, and she understood, finally and completely, that this man had killed Vivienne, that the polite voice on the other side of the door belonged to the reason her aunt had died alone in a chair in this house, and a rage rose up in her so total it steadied her hands. You killed her, she said. Say it. You came up this road 3 days before she died, and you killed her because she wouldn't open the door for you. I did no such thing, Voss said smoothly. Your aunt was 81, and her heart gave out. A tragedy. A coincidence. He let the word hang. Though I will say, since you're being so direct, that people who stand between me and what I want have a way of finding their luck run short. The wine dealer in Geneva, all those years ago, poor man, so curious, took a terrible fall down a flight of stairs. And your aunt, well, old hearts are fragile things. He paused. And you, child, have a daughter, don't you? I saw the little one at the neighbor's farm this afternoon, on the swing. Charming. Something happened to Della then that she would not be able to fully explain afterward. The fear did not leave her, exactly, but it stopped mattering. There was only the man on the other side of the door who had just spoken of her daughter, and the cold certainty that she would burn the whole world down before she let him near her. And out of that certainty came a voice she didn't recognize as her own, flat and calm. Listen to me very carefully, she said. Everything that's down in that cellar is already photographed. Every rack, every card, the ledger, all of it, and copies are already off this hill, in the hands of people you can't reach. The man in here with me is a police officer, and there are more of them on the way right now, state police and federal agents, because he called them the second he understood what your family did. She heard her own voice not shake. So here's what's true, Mr. Voss. You've spent 80 years and 3 lifetimes reaching for this, and tonight, at the very end, you're going to watch it slip through your fingers, because the second those agents get here, that cellar becomes a crime scene and evidence in the murder of my aunt, and you will never touch a single bottle of it. Not ever. And you will die reaching, exactly like your father and your grandfather, and the last thing you'll understand is that a struggling little widow from nowhere is the one who beat you. The silence on the other side of the door was different this time. Longer, and then Voss's voice came again, and all the false warmth was gone from it, and what was left was very old and very cold, and very used to being obeyed. That was unwise, he said quietly. Marcus, Bring it down. Della didn't understand at first. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Down, Cade said, and pulled her to the floor as the first orange light bloomed against the curtains. They were setting fire to the house. Not the cellar, which was stone and steel and beyond them, but the house, the wooden house, with Della and Cade inside it. And Della understood the calculation with a lurch of horror, that if they couldn't have the wine tonight, they would burn the two witnesses who could tie them to the murder, and take their chances with the cellar later, after the fire and the confusion, before the agents arrived. Cade was already moving, low and fast, dragging Della toward the back of the house, away from the front room where the flames were climbing the old dry wood with terrible speed. The back door, he said. On 3 we go out the back and we run for the cellar building. It's stone, they can't burn it, and we hold there. His eyes found hers in the smoke and the flickering light. And Della, if it goes bad, you run. You leave me and you run for Edda's and you get to your girl. Promise me. She didn't promise. There wasn't time. Cade counted, and they went, out the back door into the night. And the moment they broke from the burning house, the man called Marcus was there, coming around the corner with something in his hand. And Cade shot him. It was very loud and very fast. And then the man was down and Cade was pulling Della on, toward the black bulk of the winery building against the hillside. And behind them, the house was fully alight now, a column of fire against the night sky, roaring, throwing the whole hillside into leaping orange. And somewhere in the roar Della heard Voss shouting, no longer cultured, no longer calm, an old man's voice cracking with a rage that had waited 80 years and could feel itself losing. The distance to the winery was maybe 40 yards. 40 yards of open hillside lit orange by the burning house. And they ran it low and fast with Della's lungs full of smoke and her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. Behind them she heard the second man, the one still on his feet, moving through the firelight, and once something cracked past them close enough that she felt the air of it move against her cheek, and Cade shoved her sideways behind one of the old barrels August had left standing in the yard, and put 2 shots back toward the house to buy them a breath, and then they were up and running again. Della did not look back at the fire. She did not look at anything but the black arch of the winery door coming closer. The stone, the safety of stone, the one thing on that whole hill the Voss family could not burn. They got into the winery, and Cade put his back against the stone wall beside the arched door, and held his weapon on the opening, breathing hard. 1 down, he said. That leaves Voss and 1 more, and Voss is 86. He's not the problem, it's the other one. He looked at Della. You still with me? 20 minutes was a lie. I think it's been about 8. We need more time. And then, faint at first under the roar of the burning house, then swelling, Della heard it. Engines. More than one. Coming up the valley road fast, and then lights, red and blue, strobing across the underside of the smoke, and behind the police lights came other lights. Headlights. A whole string of them. Trucks and cars bouncing up the rough gravel road toward the burning hill. Cade let out a breath that was almost a sob. That's the troopers, he said. And that. He looked at the string of headlights behind them, and something broke open in his hard face. That's my aunt. He laughed, ragged. That's the whole valley. She saw the fire. The next minutes were chaos and light. State police vehicles flooded the property, doors flying open, troopers spilling out with weapons drawn, shouting commands into the roar of the fire. Behind them came the neighbors, a dozen trucks, 2 dozen, men and women in work clothes and pajamas and boots pulled on over bare feet. People Della had never met. The whole of Perrin Valley roused out of their beds by an old woman on a telephone, coming up the hill to a burning house because one of their own had asked them to. And in the middle of it, standing at the top of the drive in her nightgown, in a barn coat with her steel hair loose around her shoulders, and a shotgun broken open over her arm, was Edda Brennan, and beside her, safe, small, wide-eyed, wrapped in a blanket and holding tight to the old woman's coat, was Josie. "Mama!" Josie screamed when she saw Della come out of the winery into the firelight, and Della crossed that hillside faster than she had ever moved in her life, and swept her daughter up into her arms, and held her so hard the child squeaked, and buried her face in Josie's hair, and did not let go. Alistair Voss and his last man were taken 20 feet from the burning house, surrounded, outnumbered, out of time. Della watched over her daughter's shoulder as 2 troopers put the old man in handcuffs. This small, bent, ancient man in an expensive coat, the man whose grandfather had emptied a chateau, and whose father had hunted a ghost, and who had reached his whole long life for one thing, and had come, at the very end, to a burning hill in Oregon to lose it. He didn't struggle. He stood very straight as they cuffed him, and he looked up the hill at the winery, at the stone building that held the thing he had wanted more than his own soul. And Della saw his face in the firelight, and it was not fear on it, and it was not even rage anymore. It was grief. The grief of a man who understands, finally, that the reaching is over, and that his hands are empty, and that they always would have been. He caught Della's eye as they walked him past her toward the cars. He stopped, and the troopers led him, for a moment. "Your grandfather," he said, and his voice was thin now, an old man's voice, almost wondering. He carried it up a hill on his back and buried it in the dark and told no one, and got nothing for it. Nothing at all, his whole life. And your aunt sat on it for 30 years and died poor. And now you. He looked at her, and at the child in her arms, and something moved behind his ancient eyes that might, in another man, in another life, have been something like understanding. "You'll give it away, won't you? I can see it in your face. All of it. The greatest treasure on earth. And you'll simply give it back to the light." He shook his head slowly. "Fools. Your whole line. Beautiful, incomprehensible fools." And then the troopers walked him on, and put him in the car, and closed the door, and Della never saw Alistair Voss's face again except in a courtroom. The house burned to its stone foundations before the fire trucks got up the hill, but the winery and the cellar beneath it, stone and rock and steel, did not so much as blacken. The lost cellar of Valcour, which had survived a world war and 80 years of hunting and one last desperate fire, sat cool and untouched in the dark under the ruin, exactly as it had waited for Della, exactly as August Ashford had built it to. Agent Naomi Vance arrived just before dawn, ahead of a convoy that looked like something out of a film, black vehicles and equipment trucks, and a team of agents who moved with quiet purpose across the smoking hillside. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had spent 20 years chasing looted and stolen art across the world, and Kate had worked with her office years before, and when he brought her down the stone steps and through the great steel door, and she saw what was inside, Della watched a woman who had surely seen everything stop and stand and put a hand out against the cold rock as if she needed it. "I've read about this cellar since I was a graduate student," Vance said, very quietly, her light moving over the impossible dust-furred rows. "Every person in my field has. It's the white whale, the thing that got away. The greatest single loss in the history of wine, gone since 1942, and half of us believed it never really existed, that it was a legend the auction houses kept alive to sell lesser bottles." She turned in a slow circle, and when she looked at Della, her professional composure had a crack in it. "And it's been under a hill in Oregon the whole time, guarded by one family. For 80 years. She shook her head slowly. "Miss Mercer, I want you to understand what you've done, because I don't think you can yet. You haven't found a fortune. You've recovered a piece of history that the world had given up for dead. There is nothing else like this. There will never be anything else like this." The days that followed blurred together into a strange new life Della had no map for. The FBI secured the site. A wine authenticator flew in from London within 48 hours. A master of wine named Dr. Fontaine, one of a few hundred people on Earth qualified to say what the cellar truly was, and she spent a week in the cold with white gloves and a reverence that sometimes brought her near tears, examining the bottles one by one against August's ledger. Every card checked out. Every vintage was what it claimed to be. The pre-phylloxera bottles, the ones from before the sickness that had killed the old vines of Europe a century and a half ago, were real and irreplaceable, and each one alone was worth a house. The great year, the rack August had set apart, was a run of a wine so famous and so vanished that Dr. Fontaine's hands shook when she first lifted one of them into the light. She emerged from the cellar on the 7th day, pale and shining, and told Della what the collection was worth, and the number was larger than Vivienne's careful estimate, larger than $410 million. And Della felt nothing when she heard it, except the weight of everyone who had died to protect it. Dr. Fontaine stayed on after the cataloging was done, longer than she needed to, and Della came to understand it was because the woman could not quite make herself leave. On her last evening, she asked Della to come down into the cellar with her, and the two of them stood together in the cold among the sleeping rows, and Dr. Fontaine talked quietly, the way people talk in churches. "In my whole life," she said, "I will never do anything as important as this week. Do you understand that? There are wines on these racks made by hands that have been dust for 200 years, from vines that no longer exist anywhere on this earth. And every scholar in my field spent a career certain we would never touch them, never see them, never know for sure they had even survived. And they survived because a farmer put them in a hole in the ground, and his daughter kept the air right. She turned to Della, and her eyes were bright. Do you know how close it came? All of it. If your aunt had died one winter without an heir, if the damp had gotten in through a single crack, if that man had gotten his way even once in 80 years. She shook her head slowly. The whole history of it hung by a thread this thin, held by 3 people nobody ever thanked, and now it is safe, forever, because of you. I needed you to hear that from someone who understands exactly what it means, because I don't think anyone has actually told you what you saved. Della hadn't cried in front of the agents, or the lawyers, or the reporters. She cried in front of Leah Fontaine, in the cold, among the last of her family's long vigil. And the wine specialist held her while she did it. A stranger from London with her arms around a widow in an Oregon cellar, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. When it passed, Della wiped her face and looked at the rose one more time, and for the first time since she had turned the cup in the steel door, she let herself feel not the weight of it, but the wonder. Her grandfather had saved this. Her aunt had kept it. And it was real, and it was safe, and it was going home to the light. That was worth every night by the stove. That was worth all of it. Agent Vance built the other case at the same time, the darker one, the one Della cared about more. Vivienne's journals gave her the names and the dates. 30 years of a woman meticulously recording every visit, every soft threat, every car that came up the road, and the wine dealer in Geneva in 1991, and the polite Englishman, and the ones who came after. When they searched Alistair Voss's homes, Vance found what men like that always keep, because arrogance and obsession cannot resist a record. A file, decades deep, on the Valcourt cellar and the Ashford family. Photographs of the vineyard taken across the years. A timeline of Vivienne's movements in the last months of her life. And, dated the week she died, a note in Voss's own hand about resolving the Oregon matter, and a payment to a man whose name matched the second body on the hill, the one called Marcus. They exhumed Vivienne. Della gave her permission for it, and stood in the Little Valley Cemetery on a gray morning while it was done, because it felt wrong to make her aunt go through one more indignity alone. The toxicology came back 3 weeks later. Vivienne Ashford had not died of a failed heart. She had died of a compound that stops the heart and leaves little trace. The kind of thing a person would only find if they knew to look for it. The kind of thing a doctor signing a paper on an 81-year-old woman would never think to test. There was a purchase in Voss's records. There was a car that Etta Brennan had seen and never told a soul. There was, at last, enough. Della thought a great deal, in those weeks, about the people who had told her to keep it small. She called Kurt, her brother-in-law, the day the farm was saved. The finder's arrangement had taken lawyers and the FBI and the insurance interests that held the old, uncollectible claims from a chateau that no longer existed, and it had taken weeks, but in the end, the law allowed her a recovery for finding and preserving what she'd found, and it was enough, more than enough to pay off Redmond County Bank 10 times over, and never again lie awake doing arithmetic by the light over a stove. She called Kurt and told him the farm was clear, the foreclosure gone, and there was a long silence on the line. And then Kurt said, in a voice she'd never heard from him, "Della, I told you to sell it. I told you not to go. I told you not to get your hopes up." And Della, who had every right to be angry, found that she wasn't, because Kurt had been afraid for her the only way he knew how, out of a whole life of people like them getting hurt when they reached. And she understood now that his warnings had come from love wearing the face of fear, the same as her mother's silence, the same as everything. "It's okay," she told him. "You were looking out for me. You've always looked out for me. I know that. And I want you to come out here, you and the family, and see it." And Kurt, who was not a man who cried, was quiet for a while, and then he said he would, and he did. He came out that autumn, Kurt and his wife and their 2 kids, driving the whole long way, and Della watched her brother-in-law get out of his truck at the top of the drive and stand there for a long moment just looking. At the hillside, at the rows Della had already begun to clear of 31 years of tangle, at the stone foundation where the new house was rising, at the great valley falling away green and gold below them in the autumn light. She saw something work in his weathered face that she had never seen there before. He didn't say much that first day. Kurt never did. He walked the property with his hands in his pockets, asked practical questions about the vines and the water and the soil, and helped her move a down section of trellis without being asked, the way he had been helping her since Tom's funeral, because helping was how he knew to love people. But that evening, standing out among the rows with a beer sweating in his hand, while the kids chased Etta's border collie up and down the hill, and the sun went down over the valley, he cleared his throat and said, without quite looking at her, "I was wrong, Della. I told you not to come. I told you to sell it and take the sure thing, and I would have done exactly that myself, every single time." He turned the bottle slowly in his hand. "Tom would have been proud of you. He would have been scared clean out of his mind the whole way, but he would have been proud." It was the closest Kurt had ever come to saying a thing like that out loud, and Della understood what it cost a man like him, and she didn't make him say any more. She just stood beside him in the rows her grandfather had planted a lifetime ago, and watched their children play in the last of the light and let it be enough. He had been afraid for her the only way he knew how, out of a whole life of watching people like them get hurt whenever they dared to reach. She couldn't hold that against him. She had been raised in the very same fear, taught it at the same table. She had just turned out to be the first one in the family lucky enough, and stubborn enough, to reach anyway and land on her feet, and she had a whole cellar full of dead women's love to thank for it. The banker at Redmond County who had signed the foreclosure notice sent a letter, unctuous and eager, when the news reached him, hinting at wealth management services and a valued long-term relationship. Della did not answer it. That was as much revenge as she wanted, and she found she wanted very little. Vindication, it turned out, was quieter than she'd imagined. All those nights reading the notice by the stove. It was not the mockers brought low. It was simply the ground under her daughter's life going solid, and staying solid, and never opening up again. She kept her promise to Vivienne. She kept it in full. She took only what the law allowed her for the finding, which was enough to save the farm and secure Josie's whole future, and never work herself sick again. And the collection itself, the lost cellar of Valcour, all $410 million of it and more, she gave back to the light, exactly as her aunt had asked. It was more complicated than it sounded, and it took years, and it filled a great deal of Della's life for a long time. But the shape of it was simple. The wine would not go to Alistair Voss's kind of buyer, the private hoarders, the men who wanted to own beauty so that no one else could taste it. It would go into the world, some of it to museums and institutions who would show it, so that people could stand in front of a bottle blown by human breath before their country existed and feel the reach of it. Some of it, the auction of a portion, carefully done, raised a sum Della used to build a foundation, and she named the foundation for the family in her grandfather's photograph, the old man in the apron and his squinting children, so that the name Valcour, which Reinhard Voss had tried so hard to burn out of the world, would exist again in the light, on buildings, on scholarships, on a permanent exhibit that told the whole story, the looting and the murder, and the farm boy who carried it home, and the 3 women who guarded it and gave up everything, each in her own way, to bring it here. Della insisted on one thing above all others, and the historians and the lawyers came to understand she would not be moved on it. The exhibit, wherever the collection ended up shown, would tell the truth about the people it belonged to, not a plaque about a famous lost cellar rediscovered. The real story. The Chateau de Valcour, the old vintner, who died trying to guard his family's life work, whose name the FBI's researchers eventually recovered from a parish record in a Burgundy village, so that after 80 years he had a name again. His children. What was done to them, and by whom, and how the memory of them had been carried in the dark by one Oregon family for 4 generations, until it could be carried into the light. The old man in the apron got his name back. Della saw to it. It was the second promise she'd made in the cellar, the one she'd never said out loud, and she kept that one too. Some of the money she spent quietly, without any exhibit or foundation or ceremony, on things that mattered only to her. Scholarships, through the foundation, for children who grew up the way she had, in houses where you learn to want nothing, and expect nothing, and keep yourself small, so that some of them, at least, might grow up knowing they were allowed to reach. She set up a fund for the children of farmers who lost a parent to the work the way she'd lost Tom, so that the arithmetic that had nearly swallowed her would not swallow them. She never told anyone about that part. It wasn't for telling. The trial of Alistair Voss came the next spring, in a federal courthouse 2 hours north, and it was the trial the newspapers had been waiting for. The looted Nazi treasure and the 80-year hunt, and the widow, and the burning house, and the murdered spinster who had guarded a fortune for 30 years. Della sat in the front row every single day, with Etta on one side of her and, more often than not, Cade on the other. She listened as the prosecution laid it all out: the journals, the forensics, Voss's own obsessive records, the payment, the toxicology, the fire, the body on the hill. The defense tried to make the old man a legitimate collector unjustly hounded, tried to suggest Vivienne's death was truly the coincidence he claimed, tried to make Della's story too convenient. But the evidence had been gathered by patient, honest people, and it held, and it was overwhelming, and in the end the jury did not take long. Alistair Voss was convicted of the murder of Vivienne Ashford, of conspiracy, of arson, of the attempted murder of Della Mercer and Cade Brennan, and of a string of other crimes reaching back further than anyone could fully prove, but that everyone in that courtroom understood, ran back 80 years, through his father and his grandfather, to a burning chateau and a murdered vintner in 1942. He was 87 by the time of sentencing. The judge, a stern woman near his own age, looked down at him for a long moment before she spoke. "Your family spent 3 generations," she said, "and a fortune beyond most people's imagining, chasing a thing you had no right to, and murdering anyone who stood in the way, and you did it because you believed that wanting a thing badly enough made it yours. It does not. You will spend what remains of your life in prison, and it is a great deal less than you owe, and I suspect the only punishment that would truly reach you is the one you have already received. You reached your whole life, Mr. Voss, and your hands are empty." She let that sit. "And the collection you murdered for is going to hang in the light where the whole world can see it, under the name of the family your grandfather tried to erase. I can think of no more fitting end." Della did not feel triumph when the verdict was read, any more than she had felt rich when Dr. Fontaine told her the number. She felt a tired, deep relief, and something quieter under it, something like peace. Her aunt's murder was answered. Her grandfather's long silence was honored. Her mother's whole broken life had, at last, meant something. The reaching that had cost her family everything had not, after all, been for nothing. She went to the cemetery, after. She'd had a stone put up for Vivienne, and she'd done something more. Something that had taken months of paperwork and the help of a lawyer in another state, because Colette had been buried 3 years before in a cheap plot in the town where she'd hidden them both, alone, under a name she'd chosen precisely because it connected to no one. Della had her mother moved. It felt right, and it felt like the last piece of setting it right. And on a bright cold morning she stood in the little Perrin Valley cemetery and watched her mother laid to rest beside the sister she had loved and hated and run from and protected. The two of them together at last on a hill above the valley where they'd once been young and laughed in the sun, before. The stones stood side by side. Della had agonized over the words for weeks. Vivienne Margaret Ashford. She kept the faith alone. She was loved, and she knew it at the last. And beside it, Colette Ashford Mercer. She made herself a stranger to save her child. There was never a braver love. Della knelt in the grass between the two graves, with Josie beside her holding a fistful of wild flowers she'd picked on the walk-up, and she talked to them both for a while. The aunt she'd never met and the mother she was only now beginning to understand. She told them the wine was safe. She told them it was going into the light, under the Valcourt name, and that the old man in the apron had his name back. She told them Voss was in prison and would die there. She told them the farm was saved, and that Josie was going to grow up never once wondering if she was wanted. And she told her mother, quietly, the thing she had come all this way to say, that she understood now, that she wasn't angry, that she knew the coldness and the silence and the smallness had all been love wearing the only face that could keep them alive, and that it had worked, that Della had lived, that here she was, and she forgave her, though there was nothing to forgive. Grandma Vivi grew grapes, Josie said solemnly, laying her wild flowers on the stone. Etta said, "Are we going to grow grapes?" Della looked at her daughter, and then out across the valley, and something in her that had been clenched tight her whole life let go, because she'd decided, somewhere in those long, strange months, that she wasn't going to sell the vineyard. She'd thought she would, at first. She'd take the finder's money and save the farm back home, and let this hill, this place of secrets and fire and 80 years of fear, go to someone else. But the more time she spent on it, the more she understood that she didn't want to run from it any more than her aunt had. She wanted to do the thing her family had never been free to do. She wanted to bring it into the light too. She'd already begun. She and Cade, who had a way of turning up on the hill on his days off, that neither of them examined too closely, had walked the wild rows in the fall and found that under 31 years of neglect, some of the old vines were still alive, still stubbornly pushing out fruit into the tangle, refusing to die, exactly the way the rest of the family had. A viticulturist Della hired said the ground was extraordinary, that August had known what he was doing when he planted here, that with work, real work, years of it, the Ashford Vineyard could make wine again. Real wine, in the light, with the family name on the label, not hidden under a hill but standing in a bottle on a table somewhere while people laughed and passed it around and had no idea what it had cost to bring it there. They rebuilt the house the next year on its old stone foundation, and it was a real house now, a warm one, with a room for Josie and a garden of wild flowers like the ones Vivienne had grown. And Etta half a mile up the road, and Cade there more and more until the day came, a few years on, quiet and unhurried and right, that he simply stayed. Della replanted the vineyard row by row over the seasons, learning the work the way her grandfather must have, from the ground up, and she kept the cellar, the great stone chamber under the hill, but she cleared the old racks once the Valcour collection had gone out into the world, and she began, slowly, to fill it again, with her own wine, the first Ashford vintages in a generation, aging in the dark where the greatest cellar on earth had once waited for her. The Tastevin, her mother's silver cup, the key that had opened everything, Della wore on a chain now, every day. She'd had it cleaned, though she kept the dents, because the dents were the history and she wouldn't have traded them. Sometimes, out in the rows in the early morning with the fog lying in the valley below, and Josie still asleep and the new vines running green and ordered up the hill where the wild tangle had been, Della would take it in her hand and feel its familiar weight, and think about August carrying crates up this hill in the dark, and Vivienne alone for 30 years keeping the air right so not one bottle would turn, and Colette laughing in the sun in a photograph, before, and her own two hands turning the cup in a steel door. Bud, leaf, flower, fruit, fall, frost, rest, the whole life of the vine, the way it goes every year, the way it would go now for her, and for Josie, and for whoever came after. She had come up this hill a struggling widow 90 days from losing everything, taught her whole life to keep her head down and want nothing and never, ever reach. And she had reached. And it had cost, the way reaching always costs in her family. But it had not swallowed her, because she had not reached alone. She had reached with an old woman who roused a whole valley out of its beds, and an honest man who ran the clock down beside her in a burning house, and the ghosts of a grandfather and an aunt and a mother who had spent everything they had, across 80 years and 4 generations, to make sure that one day a child of their blood could stand free on this hill in the light with a silver cup in her hand and choose, finally, what to do with all of it. She'd chosen the light. Every time, she'd chosen the light. The first great exhibit opened 2 years after the fire, in a museum in the East that had spent a fortune and called in every favor it had to be the one to show the collection first, and they asked Della to come and to speak, and she almost didn't, because the thought of standing in front of cameras and critics and dignitaries made her want to hide up on her hill and never come down. Etta talked her into it, the way Etta talked her into most things worth doing. "Your aunt spent 30 years unable to say one word of this out loud," Etta said. "Your grandfather carried it to his grave in silence. Your mother died with the whole thing locked in her chest. You are the first person in this family who has ever been free to stand up and tell it. Don't you dare waste that." So Della went. She stood in a great bright hall with the recovered bottles arranged behind glass, the pre-Phylloxera vintages, and the great year, and all the rest of it, saved, gleaming, in the light at last. And in front of them, first, before a single bottle, was the thing Della had insisted on. The photograph, blown up huge on the wall, the old man in the apron, and his wife, and his 3 squinting children standing in front of a chateau that no longer existed, and their name, recovered from a parish record in a village in Burgundy, printed under it in letters 2 feet tall. The Valcour family. And beside it the true story, all of it. When it was her turn to speak, Della did not talk about the wine, or the money, or the 80-year hunt, or the fire, or even herself. She talked about them. She told the hall full of strangers about a man who had walked into that chateau in 1942 and decided that wanting a thing badly enough made it his. and who had shot an old man and burned the records and tried to erase a whole family so completely that no one would ever be able to prove they had lived. And she told them that he had failed, that a farm boy from Oregon had carried the memory of that family up a hill on his back and buried it in the dark, and that his daughters had guarded it for 30 years, and that one of them had died for it, murdered in her own chair by the grandson of the man who had started it all, still reaching, still certain it was his. And she told them that the entire point, the whole reason her family had given up everything across 4 generations, was so that one day she could stand in a room exactly like this one and say the names out loud, so that the Valcour family, whom powerful men had tried so hard to burn out of the world, would exist again in the light. Remembered, named, seen. That is what this is, she told them, and her voice was steady in the great quiet hall. Not a lost treasure found, a family that refused to be erased. My grandfather spent his whole life making sure they would be remembered. I am only the one who finally got to say it where people could hear. The applause went on a long time. Della saw people wiping their eyes. And afterward, in the crowd, an elderly woman made her way slowly to Della's side. A woman in her 90s, French, who took Della's hand in both of her small papery ones and held it. Her own grandmother, she told Della in careful English, had worked in the kitchens of a great chateau in Burgundy before the war, a place she had spoken of her whole life, a place everyone said had burned and taken everyone in it, and she had come all this way, at her age, simply to stand in a room where that place was remembered out loud at last. Thank you, the old woman said, gripping Della's hand hard. Thank you for giving them back to us. And Della, who had once believed vindication would feel like the mockers brought low, understood then what it actually felt like, this small ancient hand in hers, this name spoken in the light, and knew that it was worth more than $410 million, worth more than any of it. The Valcour collection hangs in the world now, in museums on 3 continents, and at every exhibit the first thing you see, before a single bottle, is the story of the family it belonged to. The old man in the apron and his children, and the name that Reinhard Voss tried to burn out of the world, and could not, because a farm boy from Oregon carried the memory of them up a hill on his back, and his daughters kept it in the dark and his granddaughter brought it into the sun. And on a hillside in Perrin Valley, in the rows above the rebuilt house, the Ashford Vineyard grows green and ordered where the wild tangle used to be, and makes wine again. And Della Mercer stands in it most mornings, with her cup in her hand and her daughter growing up beside her, in a house full of light and people who chose her, and she is exactly, at last, who her family fought so hard to give her the chance to be. She was never abandoned. She was saved. It just took her 34 years, a locked steel door, and a whole valley coming up a burning hill in the dark, to finally understand it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.